Hey guys, welcome to the Math Packet Review for 5th grade Duval Homeroom week of April 6th, 2020. I'm going to start by going over a little bit from each page for this week, and I'll post a new video on Monday of next week for next week's portion of the packet. Okay, to begin, I'm going to start on this page, which is asking about adding decimals. It says to circle all the problems with sums less than 5. Remember, a sum is the answer when you add. Then find the exact sums of only the problems you circled. So you don't have to actually solve all the problems on this page fully. First off, I'm going to circle all the problems with sums less than 5. I'm going to do that mentally. So if I was to add 24 hundredths to 4 and 25 hundredths, would that be less than 5? Well, 24 hundredths and 25 hundredths would only be 49 hundredths, which is less than a whole, and 4 plus less than a whole would still be less than 5 wholes. So number 1 is one of the problems that I need to solve. So I'm going to come over to the side and do my work right here to find the exact sum. First off, I have 0 and 24 hundredths. When I add decimals, it's really important for me to line the numbers up correctly by place value. So I need to line up the ones with the ones, the tenths with the tenths, the hundredths with the hundredths. In this problem, the 0 and the 4 are both in the ones place. So I'm going to write the 4 underneath the 0. Then I'm going to write the decimal point under the decimal point, and then 25 hundredths underneath 24 hundredths. This one wasn't too hard because they both had hundredths in the decimal place. All right, 4 plus 5 is 9 hundredths, and 2 plus 2 is 4 tenths. Don't forget your decimal point. 0 plus 4 is 4 ones. So the answer to number 1 is 4 and 49 hundredths. All right, that one wasn't too bad. Let's try number 2. Again, circle the problem only if it's going to be a sum less than 5. This one's a little trickier because in this first problem I have tenths, and in the second one I have hundredths. If I was to add 8 tenths to 16 hundredths, I could think of 8 tenths as 80 hundredths. 80 hundredths and 16 hundredths would still only be 96 hundredths, which is less than a whole. So this would still be less than 5. So I'm going to solve problem number 2. Okay, over on the side, I'm going to start by writing my first number, 4 and 8 tenths. And I'm going to add to it 0 and 16 hundredths. Just like before, I need to make sure to line up the ones with the ones, the tenths with the tenths, the hundredths with the hundredths. So the 0 is in the ones place. I'm going to put that under the 4. Then my decimal point. Then my 1/10, and then 6 hundredths. There is no hundredths in 4 and 8 tenths. So I'm writing the 6 hundredths over here with the empty hundredths place above. I could put a 0 in my hundredths place if I wanted to. All right, now I'm going to add. Oops. 0 plus 6 is 6. 8 plus 1 is 9. Don't forget your decimal point. And then 4 plus 0 is 4. So the answer to number 2 is 4 and 96 hundredths, which is less than 5. So my estimate was correct. All right, let's move on. Page 2 of the packet asks you to subtract decimals to hundredths. So it's kind of the same idea, except now we're subtracting. It also says the answers are mixed up at the bottom of the page. Cross out the answers as you complete the problem. So it's kind of like a really big multiple choice question. Let's begin. I'm going to write 7 and 5 tenths on the top because that's what I'm subtracting from. And then I'm going to subtract 1 and 2 tenths beneath it. Just like before, I have to line up my ones with my ones. So 1 is in my ones place, and so is the 7. Don't forget your decimal point, and then 2 tenths, and then subtract. This one was pretty simple. 5 minus 2 is 3. Don't forget your decimal point, and then 7 minus 1 is 6. So my answer to number 1 is 6 and 3 tenths. If I was to scroll to the bottom, I would see 6 and 3 tenths as one of the choices, so I know I'm probably correct. All right, let's move on to the next page, using estimation with decimals. On this page, we have some word problems. So I'm going to be using read, draw, write on this. With read, draw, write, I start by reading the problem once to just read for content. The second time I read, I'm going to read to annotate. And the third time I read, I'm going to think about what the question is asking. Then I'm going to draw a model to help me solve. And then finally, I'll write an equation. So to begin, Lori needs at least 12 liters of water to fill a water cooler. She has a container with 4 55/100 liters of water, a container with 3 25/100 liters of water, and a container with 4 85/100 liters of water. Does she have enough water? Use estimation only to decide. Explain why you are confident in your estimate. All right, I read it once and thought about what's happening. Lori has some different amounts of water to fill a cooler, and she wants to know if she has enough using estimation. Now I'm going to read and think about what's important. Lori needs at least 12 liters of water, at least that amount. She has a container with 4 55/100 liters of water, 3 25/100 liters of water, and 4 85/100 liters of water. Does she have enough water? Use estimation only to decide and explain why you know you're correct. So the question is asking me, this is the third read, does she have enough water? And using estimation to solve that. All right, now I'm going to move on to draw. So I'm going to draw a model to help me. When I think of this problem, I think of 12 is the total amount that she needs to get, and then she has 3 parts and she wants to know if they're enough. So I picture a tape diagram for this. I picture the whole cooler as being 12 liters of water, and then her parts as being the 3 other portions that might make up 12. We aren't sure yet. So she has first 4 55/100 liters. So that's my first amount. Ooh, that's an interesting 5. And then 3 25/100 liters. 3 25/100 liters. And then 4 85/100 liters. 4 85/100 liters. And the question wants to know, does she have enough? And use estimation to decide. So I'm going to estimate each of these amounts. When you see estimation in math, it usually wants you to round them. So 4 55/100 is my first amount. So I'm writing 4 55/100. And if I round that to the nearest whole so that it's easy to work with, 4 55/100 would round to 5 wholes because 55/100 would round up to another whole. 3 25/100 is the next amount, and 25/100 would round down to 0/100, so that would just be 3 wholes. And then 4 85/100 again would round up to 5 wholes because 85/100 is closer to having another whole than to having 0. So that would be 5. If I look at my estimated amounts, 5 plus 3 plus 5 is 13. And she only needs at least 12 liters. So I think that she has enough. To make extra sure, I'm going to think on the first one, I rounded up 45/100 to make another whole. On the last one, I rounded up 15. And then on this one, I actually rounded down. So I only rounded up less than a whole number, or less than a whole amount of liters. So even though I rounded up some of my numbers, I didn't round up more than another whole. So it would still be more than 12 liters for my answer. And then for right, I need to write an equation. So it'd be 5 plus 3 plus 5 equals 13 liters. And then for my explanation of why I'm confident, I would explain, well, I rounded each amount to the closest whole. And even though I rounded the amounts, the rounded amounts still wouldn't have made another whole liter. All right, let's move on to the next page. This is just a continuation of that same lesson. The next topic is multiplying a decimal by our whole number, and this is going to be our last topic for today. Multiplying a decimal by a whole number. I already know that when I multiply decimals and whole numbers, I can multiply as if they were both whole numbers and then place my decimal in the product at the end. So I'm going to set my numbers up. I like to put the longer number on top. 0 and 2/10 times 3. So I can multiply this as if it was just 2 times 3. So 3 times 2 is 6, and 3 times 0 is 0. But I know that that's not going to be my final answer because this wasn't 2 wholes, this was 2/10. So because I had 1 decimal place in my factor, I need to have 1 decimal place in my product as well. So I need to put my decimal right here. And that would be 0 and 6/10. All right, for number 2, I'm going to set up my problem. 0 and 3/100 times 3. All right, just like before, I'm going to multiply normally as if there was no decimal place. 3 times 3 is 9. Oops. 3 times 0 is 0, and 3 times 0 is 0. But I can't forget to place my decimal. So in my factors this time, I have 1 number in the tenths and 1 number in the hundreds, which is a total of 2 decimal places. The 0 is in the ones place, and then this 3 is in the ones place, so neither one of those are decimal numbers. So in my product, I need to have 2 numbers after the decimal point. So 1, 2, and then I'm going to place my decimal there so that I end up with hundredths. So my answer would be 0 and 9/100. Okay guys, thanks for tuning in today as we reviewed our math packet for this week. Like I said, I'll post a new video on Monday for next week's packet. If you have any questions, you can always call the school, or you can ask for help on Teams if you're able to log in. Thank you.